This time, Donald Trump has warned Vladimir Putin. The time has come to end the war in Ukraine, for once and for all. If an agreement is not reached, the retaliation will be massive. Specifically, this is the threat publicly made by the new President of the United States of America.
Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better.
Of course, there is a problem. The message sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? However, it does involve a couple of ideas that are not as bad for Russia as they seem. First of all, as we've already told you, forcing an agreement at this time is probably the best for all parties, but in some ways, it's still a clear victory for Russia. Why? Because if they annex a significant part of Ukraine, and this country doesn't join NATO, they will be able to claim at home that the operation has been a success. And second, if Trump is only talking about trade sanctions, honestly, I don't know if that's going to worry Vladimir Putin much. Remember, Russia is already dealing with a lot of sanctions, and that hasn't stopped their war effort at all. For example, Trump talks about tariffs on Russian goods, but what exactly is Russia selling to the world? Well, see for yourselves. Check it out. This is data from 2022, but it clearly shows us what the economic structure of Putin's Russia is really like. As you can see, what Russia essentially sells to the world is gas, oil, gasoline, coal, gold, aluminium, copper, basically raw materials. Because yes, no matter how much we're told, Russia has an economy that is still essentially based on raw materials. So, what is the problem? Well, sanctions on oil have not worked so far, and gas sales have already plummeted. So the scope for punishing Moscow in this way does not seem so great. What's more, to a large extent, the sanctions haven't worked because we're talking about exports that are important for the rest of the world. They are basic supplies that countries like China, India, and even Hungary don't want to lose under any circumstances. And let's not forget that the United States currently imports no Russian oil, no gas, no coal, and no gasoline from this country. So US tariffs would probably not affect Vladimir Putin much, if at all. On top of that, even if he were to force other countries such as China to blacklist these products, which I can already tell you won't happen, the result would be that the price of gasoline would rise worldwide, which therefore doesn't seem to be consistent with Trump's own plans. The only measure that seems to worry the Kremlin is providing Ukraine with more weapons. But for the moment, the US president doesn't seem to be in favor of that, at least not yet. Be that as it may, it is good that the new White House tenant is toughening the tone. VisualPolitik community, Trump has turned up the pressure, but whether or not a ceasefire is reached, Putin has not stood idly by, which has a lot to do with this piece of news. Check it out.
Michal, Estonia's defense costs should be set at 5%. I support an even more rapid increase in defense capability. Estonia knows its enemy well, and I believe that, as in Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, we should also aim for 5%.
The Estonian government has just announced that it intends to raise military spending to 5% of GDP by 2026, up from 3.7% to 4% in 2025. It thus joins the other Baltic republics and Poland. We're talking about an unprecedented effort in a very long time. But they are not the only ones. At NATO level, there is already talk of moving from a requirement of 2% of GDP in military spending to 3%. And the question is, why? Isn't the war about to be over? Well, with this video, you will understand all the reasons why. VisualPolitik community, it has now been over 1,000 days since Putin launched his brutal invasion of Ukraine. These days, the situation on the front remains tense and chaotic. Moscow continues to advance slowly, but at a very high price. And in recent months, we've seen major changes. For example, not so long ago, here on VisualPolitik, we told you that the United States finally authorized Ukraine to launch ATACMS missiles on Russian soil. And Putin, of course, did not sit still and responded.
Russia launches new IRBM at Ukraine. Zelensky says Putin is terrified. Officials in Kiev initially said an ICBM had been launched toward Dnipro.
It was the first time in history that such a missile had been used in an armed conflict, and that's not all. With the onset of winter, Russia redoubled its campaign to destroy energy facilities. For what purpose? Well, obviously, to leave millions of Ukrainians without electricity and heating in the middle of a cold snap. An unscrupulous strategy to which the Kremlin is unfortunately already accustomed. In fact, at this point in the war, it is the missiles, even more than the troops, that are the main protagonists on the battlefield. Be that as it may, the point is that the war has caused enormous damage, dozens of localities destroyed, and of course hundreds of thousands of casualties. In terms of Russian troops, it's estimated that we could be talking about more than 100,000 dead and 400,000 wounded, and even if this number were half that, it would still be barbaric. We're talking about the fact that the vast majority of the troops that started the invasion have been killed. Crazy. This is something that naturally has forced Moscow to use every avenue at its disposal, from forcing mass recruitments in the poorest areas of the country to obtaining North Korean soldiers, to things like this.
Russia recruits Yemeni mercenaries to fight in Ukraine, mysterious Houthi-linked company duping men into joining Moscow's war machine. Russia's recruited so many inmates to fight in Ukraine that it's shuttering some of its prisons.
And yes, they have also increased pay for many soldiers. For example, the Kremlin has begun to offer, let's just say, reasonably attractive salary packages. Some include salaries well above the national average, benefits for families, and even the promise of land in remote regions of the country, almost in the style of the old Western cowboys. In short, the Russian army has suffered greatly, and this has forced Putin to throw more and more gasoline on the fire. And this is where we come to the crucial point. This war will end someday, according to Trump, sooner rather than later. But does this mean that we will then be back to normal? Don't you find it strange that if peace is just around the corner, countries like Estonia and Poland are suddenly announcing huge urgent increases in military spending? I don't know, something doesn't add up here. Don't you agree? Well, all this has to do with the way the governments of Eastern Europe and also NATO itself view Putin. You see, when the war is over, Russia will face a titanic challenge to rebuild its armed forces, both in terms of manpower and equipment. For example, so far in the war, it's estimated that Russia has lost between 3,000 and 8,000 tanks. And of course, Putin is already making plans to rebuild his military capabilities. But Putin's desire is not what worries the West the most. Of greater concern is his need. Let me explain. The Russian economy has suffered a lot, and the only reason things haven't been worse is precisely because of the massive doping of public spending that the war has entailed. Let's just say that Putin is burning all the wood he can get his hands on. Right now, military spending is by far the largest item of Russian government spending.
Putin signs off record Russian defense spending. The budget will allocate 32.5% of funds for national defense.
And some analysts even point out that military spending is actually even greater, that it could be exceeding 40% of the entire budget. Crazy. But the point is that this spending is very labor intensive, that it's supporting a lot of jobs, including the soldiers themselves. Keep in mind that thanks to this effort, a lot of young people are mobilized and military factories are working at full capacity. Some of them, like these factories with unpronounceable names that you see on the screen, are working non-stop, 24/7. And what does this mean? Well, according to the information available, the Kremlin might think that this machinery cannot be stopped under any circumstances. That putting an end to it could mean closing shifts, factories, layoffs, unemployment, and so on and so forth. In other words, Russian managers are afraid that the end of the war will cause an economic crisis. And that is precisely why NATO and Eastern European countries believe that Putin will maintain his military effort even if the war ends. Put another way, he's going to take advantage of the moment to have a much larger army than before the war and to maintain arms production. In fact, this is exactly what we're already beginning to see.
Ravaged by war, Russia's army is rebuilding with surprising speed. The Kremlin is digging deep into Cold War inventory and relying on allies such as China, Iran, and North Korea.
Putin seems hell-bent on his grand imperial plans. He has sold a story to Russians that Russia is getting stronger and stronger, and that doesn't seem likely to change. Not least because it's working for him. So the fear that has arisen in NATO is that such a concentration of Russian force will give the Kremlin a foothold to use it again in the future. But the question is, specifically, what force do Eastern European countries have to prepare against? What does Vladimir Putin have in mind for rebuilding his war forces? Or rather, what exactly does Russia need? Well, with its Arctic units largely intact, there are a few critical areas that Moscow may be prioritizing in its plans to restore the Russian military to full strength. On the one hand, Russia is almost certainly going to try to regain its heavy artillery and tank force. Remember that in the war, they are losing armored vehicles faster than they can make them. Right now, they're making a huge effort. And what's more, the war in Ukraine has once again shown that artillery sweeps are still very effective. Next, it's very important to recover human capital, especially in terms of preparation. Let's just say say that since Putin wants to rebuild the army, the goal is to do so taking into account what they've learned in Ukraine, and that is that it's almost as important the readiness as the number. So once the war is over, it's likely that the president's new political strategy will be to keep the country in a quasi-permanent state of emergency. And of course, Moscow is also looking at the Navy, particularly the Black Sea Fleet, a military force that has been repeatedly hit by strategic attacks from Ukraine, and which Putin nevertheless needs in order to maintain control in those waters. And remember, this is important. For Russia, regaining control of the Black Sea is not only a military issue, but above all, a strategic one. We're talking about Russia's gateway to the Mediterranean. Controlling these waters means having direct access to essential commercial and military routes, something vital for a country that seeks to maintain its global influence at all costs.
There is a lot of work to be done here. The Black Sea Fleet, once the pride of the Russian Navy, has been one of the most important targets of Ukrainian attacks. From the sinking of the Moskva, the flagship of the fleet, to the attacks on Sevastopol, Russia's naval capabilities in this region have been severely affected. But that's not to say that the Black Sea Fleet is history.
Precisely along these lines, Moscow is already pushing ahead with the construction of corvettes, frigates, minesweepers, and amphibious ships, which are ideal for fast maneuvers and operations in rough waters. However, beyond the Black Sea, there is an important plan that is already underway. I am talking about the submarine force. You see, Putin is bent on strengthening his capabilities with the new Bory-class submarines that are capable of carrying long-range nuclear missiles. These submarines are not just war machines, they would be a message to the world. And then, of course, drones. Lots of drones. Putin wants lots and lots of drones. Why? Because they're cheap and have proven to be very effective. So let's recap. Russia is making a huge military effort. This doping has made its economy resilient, at least for now, and above all, has generated employment and loyalty to Moscow. And yes, let's see, I know, spending oil revenues on weapons is far from the best way to achieve prosperity, but that's not what Putin wants. Putin's aim is to have Russia under control, that there are jobs, and that people don't complain. And naturally, he also wants to regain his international influence. And for this, it is crucial to be able to sell the story that they are the real Sparta of the 21st century, that the Russian Empire is stronger than ever. And of course, as we've said, what he doesn't want under any circumstances is to risk the end of the war causing an economic and political crisis in the country. So to avoid this, Moscow seems to think that keeping the country in a permanent state of emergency is absolutely crucial. The result of this idea? Well, even if the war ends, everything indicates that we'll have a record concentration of soldiers on the western flank of the country, a growing artillery, and a very large drone force. And that's exactly what causes dread in Eastern Europe. Without going any further, here on VisualPolitik, in a past video, we already told you why many governments and many security services do not rule out the possibility of a Russian attack on NATO soil. An attack with the aim of obtaining concessions from Europe to overcome a crisis that would occur within Russia, or simply to make a mark on history. We certainly can't overlook that this could even cause the war in Ukraine to have a second round if Kyiv is not sufficiently armed. And that scenario is much more likely with an overstaffed military. And, as I've told you, this is exactly what is of concern in Europe, and what has caused the governments of Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland to announce military spending level boosts to 5% of GDP. Now then, wait a minute, because we are overlooking something, and that is that Moscow's plans might have a crack in them. Listen up.
A dark road?
Putin wants to maintain the military effort to avoid a crisis, and that is of great concern in Europe. But the point is that this strategy could also be a shot in Russia's own foot. Why? Well, because that effort consumes a lot of resources that are no longer available for other things. For instance, since the beginning of the invasion, news items like this has appeared in Russia day in and day out.
Labor shortage hinders Russian agri and poultry exports. Russia struggles with lack of truck drivers.
Indeed, Russia, an increasingly aging country, is short of workers, almost 5 million in fact. Between the massive recruitments and the exodus of nearly 700,000 people, sectors such as agriculture and freight transport have been left short of labor. The result? Well, prices in supermarkets have skyrocketed, for instance. Basic common products in Russian kitchens, such as butter and potatoes, became up to 40% more expensive in 2024. Eggs are no longer displayed on supermarket shelves, and Russians have had to tighten their belts when it comes to to shopping. This is, of course, only an example, but you get the idea. Military spending is putting a lot of pressure on prices. First, because of the government's own spending, and second, because of the labor constraints it's putting on the private economy. And that's not all.
The hydrocarbon sanctions have caused Russia to lose so much revenue that the government has been forced to dip into the National Wealth Fund, a sovereign wealth fund nourished for many years by oil and gas revenues. But maintaining the military effort will be increasingly difficult for Moscow. In fact, the currency issuances they are already making to finance the level of public spending have contributed to sinking the ruble.
What's more, maintaining such a large military force will make it difficult for sanctions to be lifted, and Russia's relations with the West to become, how shall I put it, more normal. In other words, the productive economy may continue to suffer for a long time to come. VisualPolitik community, the baseline scenario that we have been discussing for a long time has not changed. The war will have very negative effects for Russia in the medium and long term. Putin has so far managed to circumvent the initial shock with pure Keynesianism, feeding government spending, in this case, logically, military spending, to the hilt. Yet, that may be a case of bread for today and hunger for tomorrow, especially if they don't change their strategy once the war is over. In other words, Putin will have to choose between his imperial dream or the future of Russia. The problem is that Putin is a neo-emperor, a neo-czar, and so it's a given that he will opt for his imperial ambition. And that's exactly what explains why some Eastern European governments have suddenly been hit with an enormous urgency to increase their military spending. And do you know what? This brings us to the most important point of this video, and that is that right at this point, we enter a major political crossroads. If sanctions on Russia begin to be lifted once the war is over, this may facilitate Putin's imperial plans. But if the sanctions are not lifted, and the Russian economy starts to struggle in a few years, then that could lead Moscow, with a large military force, to launch some other madness in the form of a kick forward, for Ukraine again, or even perhaps an attack on NATO territory. This is a very complicated debate. The war in Ukraine must be ended. But, I'm sorry to say, Europe's problems will not disappear with the end of the war. That is to say, to increase military spending, to really arm ourselves, and to have the capacity to say to Moscow, don't even think about it. This approach could be absolutely crucial for the future of Europe. In Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, they are convinced of this, and also in the new administration of Donald Trump. Of course, other European governments have a very different position. We'll talk about that soon here on VisualPolitik, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But for now, the question is, what would you do? Leave us your opinions in the comments. And if you like this video, like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Once again, thank you very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.